This film is based on the true story of a man named Richard Kuklinski, once one of America's most dangerous contract killers. In 1964, Richard met a woman named Deborah. That night, they spent hours getting to know each other, and for the first time in his life, Richard felt what it was like to fall in love. Deborah was an innocent woman, admired by many men. The following night, Richard met some friends to play billiards. At that moment, it was revealed that Richard worked as a voice actor for adult films in his daily life. That evening, one of his friends, Earl, started talking about Deborah, calling her an old-fashioned woman because of her strong religious beliefs. Richard chose to remain silent, responding only by defeating Earl in a billiards bet. Not only did Earl refuse to honor the bet, but he also mocked Richard's job before finally leaving. Later, as a half-drunk Earl prepared to head home, he was unexpectedly attacked in his car. The scene skips to a year later, where Richard is at a hospital for the birth of his and Deborah's first child. By this time, they are married and have welcomed a daughter. However, despite having a family, Deborah still doesn't know that Richard works as an adult film producer. That night, in the middle of his busy schedule, a friend warns Richard to flee the production warehouse, as they are in trouble with the rightful owner of the business, a mafia boss named Roy DeMeo. Unfortunately, just as he is about to leave, Roy and his crew arrive on the scene, demanding an explanation for overdue production deadlines. Strangely, Richard remains remarkably calm even while facing a mafia boss. At that moment, the mafia nearly kills Richard, but Roy realizes that he isn't just anyone. Instead of killing Richard, Roy grants him time to complete his work by the next morning. After Roy leaves, Richard tries to calm himself by running his hands under boiling water. During this time, one of Roy's men returns with an invitation for him. After the confrontation, Richard returns home to see his beloved family. His demeanor shifts entirely with Deborah, contrasting his cold behavior outside. It's almost as though he has a dual personality. Apparently, Richard would do anything to make his wife happy. The following morning, Richard arrives at Roy's headquarters. Instead of a direct meeting, Roy takes him on a tour, asking about his background along the way. Suddenly, Roy pulls a gun on him, and once again, Richard's reaction is eerily calm, a flat expression that's far from ordinary. It turns out that Roy's adult video business is on the verge of bankruptcy, but Roy sees a unique potential in Richard, offering him a chance to become one of his trusted men. However, before being accepted into the mafia, each prospective member is required to prove their skills by killing a homeless man who happens to be relaxing by the roadside. When this order was given, two of Roy's men initially looked down on Richard, but here they witnessed the birth of a true hitman. Despite this, Richard seemed to have a heart of stone, remaining calm even after taking a life. The purpose of this test was simply to have the weapon used as potential evidence by Roy should Richard ever try to betray him. Going forward, Richard would be assigned similar tasks. Essentially, anyone who dared to cross Roy would have to face Richard. The mafia business is infamous for its varied ventures, one of which is illegal loans, and those who refuse to repay often meet a tragic end. Despite the high-risk nature of his work, Richard's life seemed entirely ordinary. His wife was even expecting their second child. As years passed, Richard completed each of Roy's assignments with precision. Richard has now spent a decade as the mafia's executioner. Thanks to his hard work, his family now lives comfortably. Interestingly, whenever friends or relatives ask about his wealth, Richard claims to be a forex trader. Every night before bed, he checks foreign currency movements. With this routine, his wife never suspects that her husband is a cold-blooded killer. One person who is curious about Richard's daily life is Dino, a former colleague from their days in the adult video industry. Dino was initially concerned about Richard's well-being after their business collapsed, feeling somewhat responsible for his friend. However, seeing Richard's current lifestyle, Dino is genuinely happy for him. Meanwhile, Roy's right-hand man, Josh, is seen buying several kilograms of cocaine from two drug dealers one afternoon. However, in the middle of the transaction, Josh betrays them, taking off with the drugs. Unfortunately, the two people Josh killed were actually henchmen of Gambino, a rival mafia boss who is far more powerful than Roy, which will undoubtedly cause serious trouble. The next day, Gambino's envoy, Leo, arrives at Roy's headquarters, demanding that life be paid with life. During this time, Roy had no knowledge of Josh's reckless act, but Josh often acts carelessly, believing his adoptive father would never punish him. Now, however, the situation has shifted. Elsewhere, Richard continues his day as usual, dressing neatly and pretending to leave for work every morning. Yet, after a decade as a mafia hitman, Richard now owns his own portable weapon, ready to use that morning under Roy's orders. This time, his target is Marty, a perverted man suspected of leaking information on Josh's whereabouts. Out of his deep affection for Josh, whom he considers a son, Roy decided not to punish him for his actions, but to fake his death instead. Unfortunately, it's suspected that Marty leaked this information. Arrogant as ever, Richard, who believes in no God, tests his victim's faith by demanding Marty pray earnestly. Apparently, Richard wants to see if a higher power could actually stop him. Just as he's about to leave the scene, Richard hears a noise from behind a cupboard. It turns out to be Marty's young girlfriend. However, Richard has a rule that he vowed never to harm women or children. So, despite her witnessing the murder, Richard chooses to let her go. However, as Richard was about to leave the building, he suddenly crossed paths with a hitman named Mr. Freezy. It turned out that Roy hadn't just sent Richard to eliminate Marty. He had also ordered Mr. Freezy to carry out the same task by blowing up the apartment unit. Upon arriving, Mr. Freezy immediately disagreed with Richard, allowing an eyewitness to escape. Because of this, Mr. Freezy quickly devised a plan to kill the girl. A confrontation erupted between them, leading Richard to fire a shot. In the end, Richard successfully prevented the killing of Marty's girlfriend. However, his actions had serious consequences, and that night, Richard was summoned by Roy. Word had it that Gambino's mafia boss was attempting various ways to bring down Roy. If they failed to kill him, they planned to trap him in prison. Therefore, Richard's actions could not be tolerated. Consequently, Richard was dismissed of his duties. A few days later, Richard visited a prison. It turned out that his older brother, Joey, was also a criminal. However, there was a darker truth. Many wondered how Richard could kill without the slightest remorse. It was here that we learned the truth. As children, Richard and his brother endured frequent beatings from their father. The abuse was so severe that both developed mental disorders. As a teenager, Joey murdered a 12-year-old girl, which landed him in prison, while Richard killed a friend, though his case remained unsolved by the police to this day. Apparently, Joey had asked his brother to come to request financial assistance. With $10,000, Joey hoped to hire a top lawyer to help secure his release after decades in prison. However, Richard declined his brother's request. Truthfully, after a long period without killing, Richard was beginning to feel restless. His frustration peaked a few days later when, while driving, he accidentally collided with another car, distracted by what he thought was Mr. Freezy's vehicle. The accident victim was understandably furious over the dented car. However, noticing Richard's large build, the man avoided a direct confrontation, instead mocking Richard's wife and children before fleeing the scene. Instantly enraged, Richard decided to chase him down. In his rage, Richard nearly endangered his wife and children, risking their lives due to his inability to control his anger. Fortunately, no one was harmed in the incident. However, it was at this point that Deborah began to realize that her husband was not all right. As a caring wife, she tried to have a conversation with Richard to help him express his frustrations. However, this effort only led to a disaster. Richard realized that his emotions would never stabilize unless he could return to killing. So, sometime later, Richard approached Mr. Freezy to propose a partnership. Mr. Freezy had been working alone, accepting any assassination job for those who could pay his fees. A few months earlier, Roy had even ordered Mr. Freezy to kill the woman Richard was protecting. Nonetheless, due to Richard's reputable work among hitmen, Mr. Freezy was more than happy to accept him as a partner. From that point on, Richard's life as a hitman resumed. However, he learned many things, as Mr. Freezy was known for his genius in covering up his killings. To prevent the police from determining the time of death, Mr. Freezy would typically freeze his victims for several months before disposing of the bodies. Moreover, his method was notoriously quiet, often using cyanide powder to carry out his kills. At the same time, Josh's hiding spot was finally exposed. This time, Roy had no other choice but to kill someone he once considered like a son. However, after firing the first shot, Roy suddenly stopped, prompting Leo to step in. At that moment, Leo was visibly upset because one of Roy's men, Mickey, had dared to touch him earlier. The next day, Leo sought help from Mr. Freezy to take out Mickey. To avoid any commotion, Leo instructed that the murder should look like an accident. If everything went smoothly, Mr. Freezy would receive $50,000, a substantial sum at that time. Following his client's request, Mr. Freezy planned to kill Mickey using a cyanide spray. The next night, Mr. Freezy, along with Richard, entered a nightclub where Mickey was relaxing. This time, Richard acted as the executioner. After discreetly slipping the spray onto a tissue, the execution commenced. Within seconds, Mickey was dead on the spot. However, while trying to escape, Richard ran into an old friend named Terry. As a result, Richard pretended not to recognize him, as no one could suspect that Mickey had been murdered by his hand. Yet, Terry kept following him to the parking lot, revealing that he knew Richard worked for Roy. As an unemployed man, Terry hoped for an introduction to the mafia boss, willing to do any job that would bring him wealth. A few days later, Richard was seen celebrating his eldest daughter's birthday, with close friends and family in attendance. Amid the festivities, Roy's men suddenly banged on the door, forcing Richard into a car. Apparently, his actions had been exposed. People wondered how Roy had uncovered such a secret. It turned out that Terry had contacted Roy a few days earlier, explaining at length how he'd met Richard at a bar. In the midst of the conversation, Richard's daughter suddenly appeared, sensing her father was in danger. Richard panicked, knowing that even the slightest misstep could reveal his identity. Fortunately, Roy showed some mercy and let him go. But before leaving, Roy warned them not to cross paths again, as Richard's family would be at risk if it happened. The next day, Richard called Terry to offer him a job, as promised. Hearing this, Terry was thrilled with the news. To ensure everything went smoothly, they agreed to meet at a motel the following night. However, as expected, it was a lie. Richard's real intention was to eliminate the person who had ruined his plan. Months passed, but Richard still hadn't received his payment for the last hit. Finally, Mr. Freezy informed him that, after 3 months, Leo would settle the debt. However, due to their performance not meeting expectations, the payment was drastically reduced from $50,000 to just $10,000. Apparently, Mr. Freezy was unbothered, but Richard was furious. He had intended to use that money to invest in the property business. When they met, Richard voiced his frustration, but Leo, feeling superior, arrogantly fired a shot. After taking the watch and gold ring from his victim, Richard left the scene. Now, Richard was not only at odds with Roy, but was also a target for Gambino's mafia. That night, as he headed home, Richard received devastating news that his daughter had just been the victim of a hit-and-run. Deborah mentioned that it seemed intentional, as their daughter had been struck not far from home, as if someone had been following her. Richard realized that this was almost certainly Roy's doing. The next morning, Richard and Mr. Freezy met again at a park to discuss shocking news. It turned out that Terry's body had been found by the police, who were beginning to link his death with other bodies that had been frozen. Although the primary suspect remained unknown, the authorities had dubbed the killer the Iceman. Sooner or later, the police would connect Terry's murder to Richard, as a witness had claimed they saw the two meets at a motel. Meanwhile, the situation became more complicated because Roy was now targeting their families. Rather than risk being killed by the mafia, Mr. Freezy proposed that they each kill their own families, allowing them to escape out of town without any burdens. Hearing this, Richard became furious, especially because he was suspicious of how Mr. Freezy suddenly knew his home address. His suspicion intensified when Mr. Freezy reached into his pocket, as if preparing to use a cyanide spray. Richard then decided to take out Roy before his own family was harmed. To do this, he asked for Dino's help in introducing him to someone known to sell cyanide powder. Dino also revealed that 2 police officers had questioned him about Terry's death the previous day. At that moment, Dino couldn't believe that their mutual friend had fallen victim to a hitman known as the Iceman. Little did he know, the very person he spoke of was sitting right in front of him. The following day, Richard met Dino's acquaintance, named Dominic, at a diner. Unfortunately, the cyanide powder Richard wanted couldn't be provided immediately, as it was difficult to obtain and costly. Dominic then suggested a different kind of payment, since Richard was unwilling to pay up front. As an associate of a drug dealer, Dominic wanted Richard to sabotage a transaction. If successful, they could rob the client and split the profit evenly. This way, Richard wouldn't need to spend any money to get what he wanted. If the plan succeeded, Richard could complete his savings to buy a property he intended to convert into a casino, a dream he had long harbored, evident by the sparkle in his eyes. Not long after, the day finally arrived. Richard is seen met with Dominic to collect the cyanide powder and receive details on the drug deal he would disrupt later that day. The plan was for Richard to invite the buyer for a sandwich laced with cyanide. But before heading out, Richard wanted to test the powder's potency by giving it to his daughter's pet cat. Meanwhile, since Deborah was feeling unwell, Richard needed to stop by the doctor first. However, before leaving the house, he noticed something odd. The cat that had been given cyanide was still alive. Soon after, Deborah panicked as she saw her husband surrounded on all sides. Until now, Deborah hadn't realized that Richard was a cold-blooded killer. Just before he was taken away, Dominic's true identity as an undercover FBI agent was revealed. Their operation was a massive success, and news of Richard's arrest quickly became a headline story. In the end, Richard was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. During interrogation, Richard claimed he had no regrets over the murders he'd committed, despite his victims numbering over 100. His only regret was that he would never see his family again. At the same time, his family, of course, was stunned to discover that their loving husband and father was a hired assassin. Ironically, Richard was imprisoned in the same facility as his older brother. In 2006, Richard took his last breath. He was just about to serve as a witness in the Gambino Mafia case. This raised the question, did Richard die from illness, or was he killed to silence him and protect the Mafia boss's secrets? Unfortunately, no one knows the answer. And with that, the film comes to an end. Moral lesson from the story: sometimes, keeping secrets from your loved ones might save their peace of mind, but it could also land you in jail with your not-so-proud brother. And remember, if you're going to be a hitman, at least be good at excuses. Forex trading only covers so much.